Everybody, and welcome to the last and final video, not just of this lecture on social institutions and the human concept, as well as miscellaneous things, but the entire course in general. So I would like to thank you all for all your hard work. I hope you enjoyed this class. I hope you learned quite a bit or kind of learned to think about things in maybe a different type of way. And I just wish you all the best in the future. Now, for this lecture, what we're going to be talking about is we're going to start off by talking about anthropomorphism kind of within the consumer context. And then what I want to do is I want to talk about some studies that are, pretty recent within the humanist literature. And I kind of place these in the same video with the idea of kind of a consumerism institution because the consumers studies are also pretty recent. So you'll get to see kind of where research is going right now. And that might kind of give you an idea for future studies or things to look into. Or these might just apply to your general interest of study or your major or even maybe your personal life. So on that note, let's go ahead and get started. Now, I don't know if you're like me, but a lot of my memories from childhood is kind of centered around various types of consumer mascots. And that might be because, for example, sitting at breakfast and eating cereal, you really had nothing to do in the 80s and early 90s other than read the cereal box, and often cereal boxes were filled with different types of anthropomorphic types of mascots. So, for example, there was Tony the Tiger, there was the Trix Rabbit, the frog that was on the cereal Smacks, and we could come up with a number of different other examples. But it's not just cereal boxes that had different types of anthropomorphic types of mascots. We can see in a lot of different other areas as well. But the general idea of the anthropomorphic mascots is that they were supposed to be kind of cute and enticing and engaging for, the consumers that would buy those products. Now, a study that was published this year actually found something very interesting that I really never considered, but might be very interesting for those that are looking to get into advertising or, some sort of related field. So this study by Puzakova and Kwok that was published this year looked at this idea of solo versus collective anthropomorphism. So here on the left-hand side of the slide, you can see that the collective anthropomorphism is basically like 3 different characters, where the solo is just 1. Now, something that the researchers wanted to look at was whether or not gender was going to moderate or influence the relationship between the collective or solo anthropomorphic image or mascots and brand liking and relationship with the brand. And kind of basing on different types of studies that looked at preferences for men and women, and they tend to find that women are going to be more likely to seek social connections with individuals and specific individuals versus groups, where men tend to be a bit more okay with groups as well as specific individuals. And also, when describing themselves, women are more likely to talk about one-to-one relationships, but men are going to talk about one-to-one relationships as well as larger collectives when defining their self. And this is largely understood under the idea that women tend to appreciate close relationships more than kind of broader, ambiguous type ones that we would see in some sort of group. So these researchers hypothesized that women would be more favorable to kind of these anthropomorphic mascots if they're solo versus some sort of collective group of them. Whereas for men, it shouldn't really matter. So basically what they did in this study is, this was study 2 of this article, they had men and women look at these different images. So some were assigned to the collective anthropomorphic image, and others were to the solo anthropomorphic image. So then what they did is that they looked at measures for brand attitude. So this would be 4 items in terms of favorable, unpleasant, bad, or dislike, and then favorable, pleasant, good, and like. So these are getting kind of a general brand attitude. And then they looked at kind of this expected relationship closeness with a brand. So these would be items like, I would feel a sense of closeness between the Vazoan brand and me over time. Then they looked at kind of the perceived, genderization of the brand. So very feminine or very masculine. And this is to help kind of control whether or not, men are being influenced because the brand is maybe not as masculine enough. And then loneliness, because we also see that kind of this idea of loneliness may influence how well people like anthropomorphic images. What they found is that women tended to like the solo mascot more than the collective, and this was influenced by the degree that they felt that they would have some sort of closeness with the brand. And this was a similar outcome for the attention to actually purchase the item from the brand. So in here, the corn chips. And now, importantly, the perceived femininity or masculinity of the mascots didn't have any kind of contributing factor, nor did levels of loneliness. So this might be why we often see kind of single or solo anthropomorphic mascots relative to perhaps some other types of mascots like Snap, Crackle, and Pop that's famous for Rice Krispies. And they tend to be kind of seen as more human rather than like, the mascot Tony the Tiger for Frosted Flakes. All right, everybody, I'm just going to kind of interject here. There is going to be some other studies about consumerism that I was going to talk about, especially kind of the rise of looking at AI, either assistants, chatbots, or websites that use kind of this AI that's supposed to be very human-like. But I think some of the research is a little convoluted, and I think there's a lot of mixed reporting kind of going on. So I'm actually going to cut those out from this lecture and just focus on some of the other things that I was mentioning, more specifically some of the more newer studies looking at, the human concept in a variety of ways. Now, going into these more recent studies, there was actually one that was published again this year that was conducted by Spatola and Vudersic, and this was looking at basically whether or not telling people that robots may have the potential to feel certain types of emotions would then elicit them to explicitly kind of attribute those emotions to the robots and how this may relate to anthropomorphism. And what they did in this study was basically first have participants read one of two different types of articles. One was talking about that robots would be likely to be able to experience emotions, and then the other one was that robots would not be able to feel emotions. And then they had them complete some measures, and some of these measures included measuring the primary and secondary emotions that they believed, 5 different robots would experience. This is one of them right here. And then had them complete a measure that was basically kind of a form of anthropomorphism. And then here it included the levels of warmth and competence attributed to the robot. Now, in the emotion robot condition, the one that argued that robots would be eventually able to experience emotions, participants did rate these robots that they saw, such as the one imaged here, being attributed with more warmth than the unlikely condition or the non-emotion robot condition. However, there was no difference for competence. Now, what else is interesting, though, is that they also looked at discomfort within this anthropomorphism scale, and there was no difference in discomfort either. So even reading about robots being able to feel emotions eventually did not elicit a sense of discomfort for the participants. Now, what's interesting, though, is that when they also looked at primary and secondary emotions, we can also maybe understand this within the context of some sort of anthropomorphic measure, because essentially this, even just attributing primary, but definitely the secondary emotions to robots may be something that would signify that they are more human than perhaps just a regular robot. However, when you compare the two conditions, the capacity for robots to have emotions later on versus just not being able to have that capacity, there was no difference in attribution of secondary emotions. However, to the degree that people did attribute secondary emotions to the robots, and this was either the emotion or non-emotion robots, both of them together, there was a higher level of attributions of both warmth and competence. So secondary emotion attribution was positively correlated with warmth and competence, suggesting that secondary emotions might still be kind of this idea that we can understand as anthropomorphism, just something different than both warmth and competence. Now, I think this study requires a bit more to look into to try to understand what anthropomorphism really is. Is this something that we can actually use with like secondary emotions for robots to kind of understand anthropomorphism? Or should we kind of limit ourselves to warmth and competence, or are those even sufficient? But, I think a couple key things to take away is that, one, robots are becoming a bit more kind of ubiquitous in certain areas. Some of the robots that they use in this study are being used with autism research. So they are being used in kind of larger communities. And that attribution of warmth might be comforting to certain populations that might be using them, especially in the context of counseling or some kind of clinical work. And it also suggests that maybe we should be kind of looking at anthropomorphism of robots differently than we may for something else such as an animal. And that might be because of this, the idea of the primary and secondary emotions and the warmth and competence. If these are not necessarily lining up as closely as we may expect them to, well, that might be problematic for trying to make links to additional studies that have looked at either one of these two areas, whether primary or secondary emotions or warmth and competence, in relation to robots. Now, I should also mention that they did another study, but it was more of an implicit test, and these were explicit measures. But I don't necessarily feel too comfortable talking about those implicit ones in any kind of certainty, so I'm going to only focus on these explicit ones. But what that might mean too is that because we're focusing on these explicit understandings, well, people may have different kind of conceptualizations of what robots may be capable of or not capable of, and what kind of this idea of what emotions might be in robots. And that might actually kind of be dependent on how well people understand, or the participants understand, the capabilities and different types of programs that, might be possible to lend to this idea that robots can experience emotions, or just perhaps even not. So the participant awareness of technology and what it can possibly do and what that may look like might be very important to understanding how anthropomorphism might actually be kind of understood in these contexts. So with a different population or in a different time, we might actually see completely different results if we were to try to do the study again. Now, the last study I want to talk about was conducted by Roxanne Fellig and colleagues, and then this includes Jamie Goldenberg, so you'll kind of see where this might be related to some of the other studies that we've talked about in this term. So, like Jamie Goldenberg, Roxanne Fellig is interested in looking at self-objectification and what types of consequences that might have, particularly amongst women, in their everyday lives. And in this study, what she and her colleagues did was conduct a field study outside of a nightclub, looking at the potential relationship between skin exposure and feelings of cold based on levels of self-objectification. Now, the study itself took over the span of 5 days, and the temperature outside was about 11.4 degrees Celsius, which, for the setting it was, which was Florida, was actually pretty chilly, pretty cold for that area. However, probably not too cold to discourage people just standing outside, enjoying a cigarette, or waiting in line. So the total participants for the study were 185 women, and what they had the women do was to complete a measure of trait self-objectification, and this would have items like, during the day I think about how I look many times, and I think more about how my body feels than how my body looks. And importantly, that last one is reverse scored. Then they asked participants how cold they felt on a 6-point scale from not at all cold to extremely cold. So things that may affect this might be the actual temperature, as well as the amount of alcohol that they have drank that night. So they also collected measures for those to control for those. So when I talk about the results, this is considering that basically they're controlling or equaling this idea of the actual temperature as well as the amount of alcoholic drinks they've had. Now, something else that they did was measure skin exposure, and how they did this was to take photographs of the women, and they had them anonymous so they couldn't be identified in any kind of way. And then, based on various types of body parts that were exposed in certain ways, they would give them a score. So basically, it was a kind of a 1 point for exposed arms, shoulders, legs, chest, back, midriff, and toes. And there was also consideration if the participant was not wearing a jacket or had large rips or tears in their pants that would otherwise be understood as pants, but would still expose a significant amount of skin. So one thing you would expect is that the more skin exposed, the colder the woman would be. And this was actually found for those that reported, these low levels of self-objectification. The more skin, the colder that they felt. However, for those that had high levels of self-objectification, there was actually no correlation between skin exposure and feelings of cold. And what's interesting is they conducted analysis to see exactly at what point did this idea of self-objectification create some sort of correlation between skin exposure and feelings of cold. And what they found was that even at mean or average levels of self-objectification, there was no correlation between skin exposure and feelings of cold. It is only just a little bit lower than mean levels for self-objectification where we start to see this positive correlation actually arise. So basically what they're arguing here is that self-objectification at high levels, but as well as average levels, tend to have no relationship between skin exposure and feelings of cold, at least at this temperature of around 11.4 degrees Celsius. Now, some alternative explanations that might account for this other than just self-objectification would fall under the ideas of cognitive dissonance as well as habituation, according to the authors. Now, the argument for cognitive dissonance would be that women that were exposing more skin were more cold, but they didn't want to admit that they were being cold even to themselves, so they had to deny it in order to kind of, maintain that attention and energy devoted to their appearance. So basically, because their decision is putting them in a state of discomfort, they're going to deny their discomfort so that they don't feel, any kind of negative emotions about feeling what they're wearing or not wearing. So another alternative explanation that they offered is that it might just also be a sense of habituation, that people that are wearing, less clothing or exposing more skin are just kind of becoming used to colder weather in those types of outfits. So as an American, from Michigan, which is still pretty cold, when I moved up to Edmonton, I still saw people wearing these shorts and t-shirts in very cold weather. So there might be some sort of thing to this habituation. However, if we actually look at the arguments that they make for self-objectification, I think that's also highly likely, and it's going to be something that is kind of something that encapsulates a lot of different other types of, self-objectification studies. So the general argument is that, self-objectification is kind of like this external monitor of oneself. So you're kind of viewing yourself almost in a third-person perspective, or kind of focusing more on this third-person perspective rather than like inside your own body. And because your attention is focused on your outside appearance rather than your internal bodily states, your internal bodily states tend to be more ignored when you're engaging in self-objectification. So kind of the argument here is kind of an allocation of cognitive resources. Where is your attention focused at? Is it focused on the external, such as your physical appearance, or is it focused more kind of internally on your bodily sensations, such as feeling cold? So the argument here that they're proposing is at least partially self-objectification is kind of taking cognitive resources away from bodily sensations and more towards these external appearance. And this is why we see similar types of studies where, women who rate high on self-objectification are going to be better able to kind of withstand the discomfort of wearing high heels or even corsets, which kind of really restrict that breathway. Or in some traditional cultures, things such as feet binding. So this is probably going to be a better explanation than the alternative ones, such as cognitive dissonance and habituation, because even with those that had low levels of self-objectification and still had a lot of skin exposed, didn't necessarily show the same relationships as those that had high self-objectification scores. Now, something I think might help this argument a bit more is to see whether or not this is something that might happen to men in certain types of situations as well. However, you had to find situations where men are going to be more likely to engage in some sort of self-objectification or take some sort of outside perspective of themselves, and that might be a little bit harder to do just because societally speaking, the focus on men is not so much on their physical appearance as other types of characteristics. So this might be something that would have to be probably looked at in very specific types of situations where the physicality or the physical appearance of men is going to be very important. Or you might be able to manipulate certain situations where it becomes important, and you could kind of look at whether or not that division of cognitive resources, such as attention, is going to influence sensations of discomfort or even perhaps other types of physical sensations. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it there. We are all finished with the term. Again, thank you for all your hard work. Remember, your exam is next week, and if you have any questions, I will have office hours on Monday and Tuesday. And best of luck to each and every one of you.